We will be focusing our time in Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11, verse 12 will be our primary text and following. For your information, the cleansing of the temple that's recorded here in Mark and the barren fig tree are found in the three synoptic gospels. That's the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 through 22 is the Matthew account. Mark 11, verses 12 through 18 is the Mark account. And Luke 19, 45 through 48 is Luke's account. Luke only records the temple. He does not record the fig tree. So he only records the cleansing of the temple.
But Luke does record a parable about a barren fig tree in chapter 13.
He does record it. That is true. And that, I guess I didn't really think about that. That lends itself to what I'm pulling from the Mark account.
Yeah.
I did not catch that. But I'm going to, at the end of my lesson, I'm going to go ahead and give you the cliffhanger right now. What I look at Mark doing is Mark is giving us a living parable. Through verses 12 through 18, he's giving us a living parable. Really, it's kind of into verse 20. Was it 25? 25, 26. That he's giving us this living parable of a fig tree and an analogy that is Jerusalem. So that's kind of give us some insight to what we're leading up to. Let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer before we begin. Father, we come before you and we're very thankful. Father, I'm thankful for the life that you've given to each one of us, for the soul that you entrusted into us, and the souls that we impact in our life. Father, I'm thankful for the people who are here in person, for their love for you. I'm equally thankful for the people who are here virtually. Their love for you and their commitment is just as great, just as strong. And Father, as we are joined together today, I see the way that our world has changed. I see the way that technology has introduced new opportunities. Things that a year ago weren't mentally or feasibly possible have become possible. And the way that your church can take these avenues and expand to a world beyond just our building, just beyond our teach. But Father, to expand your gospel message into a place that truly can reach everyone. To know that as messed up as this last year's been, that there have been some blessings, and that's one of them. And Father, to be sitting here today, to be sharing with one another through this account, I pray that we are each challenged in some way. I pray that we see something different, something that we may not have noticed before, and that we would begin to grow even more in our love for you. This is our prayer through your Son, Jesus, the Holy One we pray. Amen. So as I said, we'll be in the Mark account today. Reason I chose Mark is slightly the most detailed account. Matthew and Mark are very similar. In biblical study, we account that Mark was probably the first document written. And so in that account, we're going to say that Mark's going to be the one that I'm going to prefer for today's account. Like I said, the greater detail given lends it for my personal choice. I've shied away from Luke. I'm very familiar with Luke on today's account. But Luke didn't give us a depth that I was hoping to receive or that Mark, I feel, gives us. Luke covers from a different angle, and that's perfectly fine for Luke's account. But as I said, Luke doesn't cover the fig tree. He focuses more on the temple scene. And I like what Mark does when I said that Mark, I'm going to use the phrase sandwich. Mark uses a fig tree sandwich. Jim, have you ever had a fig tree sandwich? You have a fig tree though, too. I've never had a fig tree sandwich, but I have had a fig too. I don't have a fig tree, but I look at Mark's account like a fig tree sandwich. You'll notice in verse 12, we begin the account of the fig tree, and that goes basically through verse 14. And then you pick back up at verse, was it 20? Yeah, verse 20 pretty much, where the fig tree comes back into the scene. Then there's this, I'm going to call it an application. It's found over in chapter 13, verse 28, where Jesus draws a final conclusion to the fig tree. Now this is Mark 13, verse 28. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. So I see what I'm seeing Mark do is providing this fig tree sandwich. He really puts the fig tree at the beginning, he puts the fig tree at the end, and the stuff that he compressed in between it, the meat, if you will, or the peanut butter of this, is the destruction of the temple. By the way, I love a good peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The thicker the peanut butter, the happier I am. And that's what Mark does here, is he puts the destruction of the cleansing of the temple as his meat or his peanut butter in this sandwich. So that's kind of the outlook that we're going to take for today. As you begin, we're going to try and just go through this fairly much as the text lends it. This is Mark chapter 11, verse 12. The next day, Jesus was leaving Bethany, and Jesus was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to find out if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it.
That's harsh.
I was going to say that's pretty cut and dry. Laura said that's harsh.
It does sound harsh.
Laura, why is that harsh?
Well, because it's a pretty little tree with pretty little leaves, and it's not yet the season, but he's like, "You're done." And it's like, ooh, that just seems harsh.
You know, does anyone else see the harshness in that?
It seems out of character when you put the phrase in there, "It was not the season of figs."
Figs don't ripen until late October or September, really, early October. There wouldn't have been any figs that time of year. So to expect them is unusual.
So for those of you who were online couldn't hear, Jim Hall made the comment that figs will ripen in pretty late August to maybe early October region. And this is the season, this is probably springtime. It would not be an appropriate request for the fig tree to be having figs right now. So it does. And as Greg said, the story makes complete sense until you get to that clause, it was not the season for figs, end of verse 13. Linda, I know you raised your hand. Did you have a comment, or were you just agreeing that seems harsh? That seems harsh. As you read this, the first thought is, man, that is harsh. I mean, we know it's not the season for figs, or it's not, into verse 13. So why would Jesus curse the tree?
Maybe it was a warning. We're supposed to bear fruit, and it wasn't bearing any fruit. So it was a lesson to say, hey, if you're not bearing fruit, off with you.
A lesson on bearing fruit. Mm-hmm. And if you're not bearing fruit, off with your head.
That's right. Done.
There you go. So, and yet again, the trouble still is that verse. If you expect fruit, and if it's the time for fruit, then fruitfulness should be. But it's not really the time for fruitfulness. So we're still left with the conundrum of, why did Jesus curse this poor fig tree? Some people will look at this and they'll say that, actually, I forgot what commentary it was now, but the author made a comment that he said, I cannot trust in a Jesus who does this to a fig tree because of that reason. I thought it was kind of a childish response, but he in turn was saying that Jesus was acting more like a temperamental teenager in this response. And from the first and immediate reaction, I would look and say, man, Jesus is just being a spoiled brat. He didn't get his fruit, and so he's going to be gone with the tree. So there's a little commentary that I really appreciate. I have an Old Testament and New Testament version of it. It's a historical background commentary. Greg, do you remember the name? It's about 3 inches thick.
That's what it's,
Oh, is that what it's called?
the historical.
Historical commentary. It's put out by IVP Press, and they provide some insight to this. They would say, as Jim told us, the actual time of figs would be really kind of pre-fall to fall time, August through October region. But basically, from my understanding, a fig tree would lose some of its leaves, but it would begin budding after harvest. And those buds would form and would stay on through until spring. And those buds, the Hebrews called them pagim, which could be eaten. Hosea 9 and verse 10 would actually talk about the eating of the early fruit of the fig tree. So it seems that what we're experiencing here is our lack of understanding of what they persaw as fig trees. They would see that a harvest would take place in the fall region, that then the tree would bud out this, I keep calling it a knot. That's about the only thing I know to liken it to, just like some sort of little leaf-like something that could be eaten. And those weren't necessarily supposed to be ripe at the time that Jesus was coming through, but they were supposed to be edible. And what else is interesting about this little pagim is that this pagim, if the tree had these pagims on it, it would drop them, and then it would begin actually producing figs. However, if the fig tree did not have any of the pagim on it, it would not produce figs that year. It would be a barren tree. So what we then see is a little different picture into our text. Jesus comes to a tree that should have had something on it. It would not have been a fig per se, but it would have been something that could have been eaten. And when Jesus comes to it, there's nothing. So he sees a tree that's full of leaves, that's really a pretty tree, that by all accounts looks like it's perfect, like it's got its act together, like it is going to produce a fruit. But upon closer inspection, that tree's not going to do anything this year. Taking that mindset, we come to verse 15. Jesus is walking to the temple, and as he is reaching Jerusalem, verse 15 says, he enters the temple courts, and he begins to drive out those who are buying, selling, and trading in the temple. It seems that Jesus enters what I'm going to consider the temple, the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles, by rough estimates, is about 35 acres in size at this time period. So it's a pretty large section of land. To say that Jesus threw over every table and cast out everyone, I don't know if he did. I'm not going to put doubt onto Mark's account. But I think what we're seeing is more a microcosm, that Jesus is going into a place where they're doing all this buying and selling, and he is throwing over every table he comes across, and he's causing an uproar. Now, I want you to know 35 acres is a pretty large set of land. The church property, by the way, what is it, 7 acres, I think? And it goes back through the trees, and it goes somewhere back over towards another road. So even our church property here would only be about a fourth of what the temple or the court of the Gentiles was like. It would have been a massive colonnade. It's said by Josephus that the columns in the court of the Gentiles were so big that 3 men grabbing hands could barely reach their hands around it, supporting some form of lattice work or covering so that people would be in some form of shade. And we notice in verse 15 that those who were buying and selling there, which is interesting, if you lived a long way away, what were you supposed to do? How were you supposed to sacrifice?
Deuteronomy 14 would say that you convert it to silver and then you take it to wherever the Lord would choose. And there you buy what you need.
So instead, thank you for Deuteronomy 14. Glad you knew that just offhand too. But for the Old Testament account, what they would say is, look, if you lived off in modern day Turkey, let's say, you were not expected to haul all your animals and your sacrifice down to Jerusalem for the sacrifice. What would happen if you hauled an animal that far for sacrifice?
Well, he probably wouldn't fit the bill for sacrifice by the time you got there, maybe.
You have an animal who probably broke a bone somewhere along the trip. He's no longer not blemished. In some way, there's a weakness. Have you ever tried to herd birds? What about the poor folks who had to sacrifice birds? How do you herd a bird? Well, you throw in a cage, I guess. But, in their time, they didn't have bird. I guess they could keep a bird alive. The point is that the buyers and sellers in the temple were some form of a natural place. Maybe not in the temple. Maybe that's the problem. But the buying and selling that occurred in Jerusalem is expected. That's not necessarily a wrong thing. Because if you came from, and I'm just using modern day Turkey as an example, that's kind of, that's far north region of where the Jews probably would have been at that time traveling in from. You could say Egypt if you wanted to. They were expected to convert it to silver and then go to Jerusalem or go to wherever the Lord has called them to go. And from that point, they were to buy all the things that they needed for the sacrifice and for whatever festival they were there for. That way, you had a guaranteed good sacrifice. That way, you could more easily and quickly travel. This was all planned out by God for that purpose. So we go to the idea that buying and selling isn't necessarily the evil that we're going to talk about. A little ways further, he overturned the table of the money changers. Are the money changers necessarily the evil there?
Not necessarily, because they couldn't use the Roman coins for the temple because they had an image of Caesar on it with the phrase, the divine one or the Savior.
So for what Greg said, you've got people coming from all over the known world at that time. They're coming with their own money from their own culture. They may not have what would be local money or money that's approved in the temple service. Matter of fact, Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16 talks about a person who is going to be contributing to the entrance of the temple is to give half a shekel. And it's supposed to be pretty much a standardized temple tax. What's the problem if you've got money from one place and money from another place and money from another place? And as Greg said, you have Roman money that has the image of the divine one, in quotes, on it, that would not be approved. How in the world are these people supposed to come and pay their temple tax? Unless you have a money changer. Let me liken it to this. If we had a modern day temple, and in order to get in the modern day temple, you had to pay 100 Israeli dollars to get in, how would you do it? Well, they don't accept Visa. So you're going to have to go to somewhere where they do a currency exchange, get your American dollars converted over and say, well, I don't even know how much 100 Israeli dollars is in US currency. I know Israel's a good friend of ours. They accept US currency. However, if I've got to pay 100 Israeli dollars, I've got to convert that over. So the money changers themselves aren't necessarily the wrong. What about those selling the doves? What about those selling the doves? That's the next group here. He says the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. Yet again, a poor individual who has now traveled. I asked the question earlier, have you ever tried to hurt a bird? You kind of get the picture of someone trying to hurt a bird in your head, don't you? And you laugh. For a poor individual, what was the command? Was it 2 doves or 2 pigeons? Was the sacrifice for a poor individual? So the ability to buy your sacrifice was needed. And by the way, in order to me this is the best representation. I don't have a standard on the doves. However, Josephus records a Passover sacrifice, and I don't really know what year or anything about this. I do know that this was the number he gave. At a Passover sacrifice, Josephus said that they sacrificed 255,600 lambs. 255,600 lambs. I just wish I had that in dollars in my bank account. That was the sacrifice just for Passover. And Josephus's further comment on that number is that it was so much of a sacrifice that the priest could barely keep up with it. Some other accounts would say that priests would be wading in blood up to their knees in the sacrifice. This is a big business. It is not like this is small business here. We're not talking like a couple of 100 people show up and they want to sacrifice their birds. We're talking thousands of people.
The Josephus account, or at least a reference that I read recently, said that for each of those lambs, there was supposed to represent 10 people. So the population of Jerusalem had exploded.
So would that be 20 million?
Upwards to 2 million to
2 million?
to 3 million somewhere. And that's probably exaggerated because of Josephus, but
Even if it's a little, let's give it 20% exaggeration. That's still a mind-blowing number.
Yep.
So when we think of the lambs, when we think of the doves, when we think of this entire market, what we're experiencing is not some little hillbilly, in Texas, there's the Canton Flea Market sale, and it's a big deal. People like to go there. And it's just a whole bunch of guys or gals who have their stuff and they're going to sell. This is a production. This is like going to a mega mall where you're buying the things that you have to have for your faith and for your religion. By the way, I'm going to go on a tantrum real quick. People see churches coming and they still jack up the prices. Matter of fact, when a church wants to petition to buy something, the prices typically go up.
Josh, can I interject this thought?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I may be backing up here a little bit. It says Jesus and the 12, they came into Jerusalem that night, and it was late, so they left, went back out of the city, and this is before they came upon the tree. You ever had something on your mind you didn't like, and you thought about it all night? I think maybe the Lord this was very personal to him, what was going on in the temple.
yes.
And I don't want to put him down on our level, but he was probably a little perturbed, thinking about it all night. And then knowing the next day, and unfortunately that tree was in his way. And in the big picture, he was telling with that tree, no fruit. If you're not bearing fruit, that's not what I want to see. And he used the tree, but the writers have broken this down into different parts, and I think it's just a preceding of the story, the start of the story, and then going on to the end, and where he ends up with what Caesar is Caesar, what God is God. And I think that's his ultimate thought there. And, but, you know, if you just put it down on our plane, sometimes you go to bed thinking about something, and you're a little aggravated about, you know, it's not going right, and it gets personal, and it gets more personal the more you think of it. And I think Jesus was really, time he got to the temple, it was real personal. They were dishonoring his father, and that he didn't like that.
One, and you know, he takes that point of dishonor very seriously down in verse 17. I mean, I guess I should say he took it very seriously when he's throwing over the tables. But he takes it even more seriously when we get down to verse 17. He says, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, which is a reference to Isaiah 56 and verse 7. But you have made it a den of robbers. Jeremiah 7, verse 11. What? We've established the fact, or the reality, that the occupations that we're talking about are a necessary part of Jerusalem. Why is it a problem for Jesus, though?
Maybe they were cheating people, raising prices or undercutting the goods in some way, and then cheating the people who were buying and sell, or who were buying. So they were being cheated. So they weren't getting exactly what they were paying for.
You know, I made the comment a moment ago that oftentimes if a church is trying to get something, chances are people in the marketplace will say, oh, here's a church function. They're gonna need this. They're gonna want this. We can charge what we want for that. Not that that's necessarily wrong. That's their choice. But that mentality of these people need this, so therefore I can do that. Mm-hmm. Think of the poorer person who's buying the pigeons. That's what they need. It's not like they've come and are wanting to have pigeon for dinner. They have a need for this. And I think that the possibility that these people, the money changers, the sellers, all of the people that are intertwined in this moment, I think there's a real possibility that there are some people running around who are taking advantage of the poor. And then let's not forget who actually controlled the temple complex.
The high priest.
And what little group of people was he a part of?
Generally a Sadducee.
A Sadducee, possibly part of the Sanhedrin. And so do you think it's possible they had their hand in the kettle?
It's not possible. It's highly probable.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus had his hand in the bag, so why not?
In Michael Card's commentaries, he calls it the Annas Bazaar, which was named after a high priest. Mm-hmm. And it was outside of the temple area, but about the time Jesus came along, they had moved it inside the temple area. And so when you have the first cleansing of the temple, if there is a first and second, that might have spurred the Pharisee Nicodemus to come and say, okay, you did this, I approve of this, so I want to talk to you further.
By the way, you made up a really good point that I forgot to mention. We are building the assumption that this is the second cleansing of the temple. The first presumed cleansing of the temple is John chapter 2. The reason we say that there's actually two, you'll notice Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the cleansing really close to Passion, or really in part of Passion Week, the week leading up to the resurrection. John seems to record the cleansing of the temple in the first year of Jesus' ministry. Building on that assumption, we're calling today's lesson the second cleansing of the temple, which is kind of mind-blowing. I never really thought of there being two cleansings of the temple, but they saw Jesus coming again. And what you were saying is what I think we are, or what I'm going to say we're seeing part of as well, is how, if you want the really good, like, spot at the mall, like you want the really good real estate, you pay a premium to be by the doors. You pay a premium to be in the good locations. Well, who would be the one determining where those locations were determined? The high priest, probably a group of Sadducees. They're the ones that are going to be determining who can buy and sell inside the temple. I think we would be foolish to assume that they don't have their hand out and in each one of these little businesses saying, well, you need to give us a percentage of your profit. You need to pay us so much for your access to this region of the temple. So I think the first crime, the first wrong we see is that these people are taking advantage of those people who are less fortunate. I think the first thing we see is being taken advantage of. The second thing I think we see, and this is leading us back to where Chris was taking us, the disrespect for the temple. And more so, I'm going to say Jesus's comment, and this is expanding out of just the Judaism for a moment. I think the disrespect comes because it was at the court of the Gentiles. Not just because it was the court of the Gentiles. It was the temple complex, and that should have been kept as holy, a place of prayer, as verse 17 would say. But who was allowed in the court of the Gentiles?
The Gentiles.
The Gentiles.
Mike Walter's online, but his mic's not working.
Okay.
He emailed, or he texted in a comment. Perhaps they were set up in the court of the Gentiles, hindering them from God.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. You're reading my mind. It's this, is it not symbiosis? Mike, you're reading my mind.
Josh,
They are.
I'm
That's
sorry.
Larry, can you say that again? I
I,
might have our volume turned down in here, and
I have a commentary that says that
oh,
there
that's
kind
why.
of
Say it again.
kind of two things going on here. This commentary says that the Jewish religious leaders were interfering with God's provision because they were allowing the court of the Gentiles to become a noisy, smelly marketplace. And they not only took financial advantage of the people, they also robbed the temple of its sanctity. And that's one comment you just made. I just wanted to throw that in out of this commentary.
Thank you for that, Larry. And I think that is spot on for what we're really seeing here. What I want us to know is that these positions, or these places of work, if you will, they're not the problem per se. It's not necessarily that those are wrong. And even if you are selling a pigeon, it's reasonable to sell a pigeon for a reasonable, you got to support your family. And if that's your business, there's a reasonable expectation of financial gain out of this. However, I think we see the people taking advantage, and greater, what I think Jesus's real frustration is, and the reason I say this is because if you go to Luke's account, Luke doesn't record the buying and the selling. He just records the money changers and the table of the doves. We're seeing a flat disrespect for the temple itself in a place where the court of the Gentiles is the place that everyone was allowed to enter. So this was the place where everyone, Gentile, it didn't matter where you came from. You were encouraged and welcomed in this place, as Jesus says, to pray. And now if you're trying to pray in the middle of the mall down here, well, I mean, you can pray. I mean, you could sit at the table and you could pray. I think, Laura, we've prayed probably at a table down there before. Mm-hmm. But how holy does it feel if you're going to try and have your worship service in the middle of the food mart, what's that food place? Food court at the mall while everyone's trying to buy and sell their own dinner. How holy does that feel? And Jesus knows that the temple has a certain holiness to it. The presence of God dwells here, or supposed to. And I think that's where he references Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7, is he knows that this is the place that everyone is welcome. It's not like this is inside the place where only the Jewish men could make it. This was in a place where everyone was supposed to be, that everyone was welcome.
Josh, you didn't, I think you mentioned this.
Yeah.
Jesus didn't get mad at sinners, prostitutes and all those, but he got mad at the church people. And so sometimes I think we as church people take it out and get mad at sinners, and we get angry with them and try to condemn them. And that's just the opposite of what Jesus did, as far as I can see.
He does get mad. Once you think of the woman caught in adultery, you think of so many times when Jesus looks to a person in a sin and has compassion, has love, has empathy for them. I guess I can't say empathy, has sympathy for them. He understands. But it's the times when you have the people who should know, which leads me back now to how Mark concludes. After we leave this temple moment, the verse 18, the chief priests, they're looking for a way to get rid of the guy. But verse 20, Jesus is leaving. The disciples are saying, look, the tree has withered. It has died. This brings me back to the fig. Remember that when they approached the fig tree, they saw what they thought was life. They saw what they thought was going to be fruit. And upon inspection, they realized there wasn't anything there. When Jesus approaches the temple, and as he's getting closer, as he hears all the stuff going on, I think at one point, before you see what's happening, there might be a moment of anticipation, a moment of expectation that what we're going to see is life, what we're going to see is fruit, what we're going to see is the Jewish faith exploding in the lives of people. And when you actually get to this temple court, what you actually see is not a place of fruit. You see a place that looks good, but there's not really any change. There's nothing really good coming from it. Any thoughts or comments? I have 2 points that I'll leave you with, and then we'll wrap up class. I think point number 1, the temple scene shows us that Jesus highlights God's desire for all nations to experience the glory of God. I think this is a welcoming scene. The temple was designed to welcome people. Yes, there were places that certain people weren't allowed, but it was designed to welcome people. And then point number 2, the fig tree gives the appearance of fruit, but that does not constitute fruit. It may look healthy, but in reality, it is dead.
Which is a perfect segue into your Revelation study, by the way.
Who is it?
The looking good and being dead.
Oh,
One of the 7 churches.
that's good. That's good.
Repeat that.
That's a segue into the Revelation study. It wasn't Pergamum.
Sardis or Laodicea.
One of the 7 churches looked really good. They had the illusion of good works, but they were really dead. So, like I said, when we started class, I see Mark doing here between the opening verse that we started in verse 12 and the closing verse of verse 26 or 25 is that he is making a fig sandwich. Except the fig is a parable of what Jerusalem. And I think as Chris pointed out to us, Jesus comes into this temple with a hope and an expectation, but he is horribly let down. And so then he weeps. He cries over Jerusalem because he knows the sin that exists. He knows there's only death.
Which is sort of gives us the freedom to be angry. Sometimes we struggle with that as Christians. And God didn't say, be slow to commit adultery, but he said, be slow to be angry. And so sometimes we have to, have to sort of balance that out, but be angry against, like you said, trying to analyze that and figure out what it is that you're angry about, and it's okay. Jesus gave us the freedom to be that.
Thank you, Bob.
You're talking about the sandwich effect. That's a characteristic of Mark's gospel. He often starts one story, inserts another one, and then completes the first story. The example is Jairus' daughter. He inserts the in there who touches his robe in the center of the story. And then
Josh, I had one commentary that kind of took verse 25 there. When you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive them so that your Father in heaven may forgive your sins. And they kind of applied that to the fig tree. Why didn't Jesus heal that fig tree so that it could produce? And then went on to say that this was kind of prophesying the judgment when everything's final. It's over and done with. You've had it. You've finished everything that you could do, and you're going to die.
Boy, thank you, Larry, for that. That's a good wrap up to that. That puts a good little bow on the end of it, in my thinking. Thank you for your attention today.